welcome. I'm Maladrum, and today we are going to be continuing in our Skyrim Creation Kit Advanced Tutorial series. My recent tutorials, I guess you could say, technically haven't been Skyrim Creation Kit tutorials. They've been Blender and GIMP tutorials, but bear with me as this is necessary to get our custom sword into Skyrim. And of course, you can always use other preferred programs, other softwares that you prefer, like Photoshop or Maya or whatever, but do what is necessary to follow along. But in these tutorials, again, I'm using Blender and GIMP. So in my last tutorial, we talked about getting the blood and lighting effects to work. We'll only see those in-game next tutorial, because that's when we will be actually putting together our NIF to put our sword into Skyrim. But in this tutorial, I'm going to talk about textures and maps. We've talked a little bit about textures before when we were actually making the textures. Now this right here is a texture for Bethesda's Steel Sword for Skyrim that I pulled from the game. And the reason I'm going to go over these maps using this is because if you have been here for previous tutorials, you would know I started off just making a simple sword, and then I took my own time to work on a better sword to continue on working with. Well, I kind of took a cheap way out on the textures there, just to jump into the next tutorials. It was pretty dumb because really it's technically not an easy way out, and I want to show you what I mean. This right here is my UV texture for my sword, and you might be wondering what all of this is. If you haven't seen my tutorial on texturing and UV mapping, all of how that works in Blender, I suggest you go watch that before continuing with this video. But that's if you want to know how this works. But when I did my texturing, I marked every single line as a seam, which means it acted as if every face was separated. And again, I did this so that I could jump into the next tutorial. It was kind of dumb because let me tell you, this is important. Things need to be properly mapped if we are going to work with textures. Like, see here, this is cut up perfectly. As you can see, you have the full parts of the blade here. You only need to mark seams where basically it would unfold. Think of a cube. It would kind of look like a T shape, a lowercase t shape, after you mark the seams and unwrap it in UV. That's what it should look like, and that's what happened here. They did it properly. I didn't do it properly for this new sword that I made to continue with. I did do it properly for the original sword, so if you want to go back and look at those other tutorials, they're good, they're accurate. Don't worry, I do teach you how to do it properly, but this is the improper way to do it. Never do it this way. Let's get a little more into why this is a bad idea. Think about if you wanted to work on how your sword is lit. You can you can grayscale it and black out certain parts to affect which parts you want to have more reflection of light and which parts you don't. And I'll show you that in Bethesda's Steel Sword for Skyrim. This is their environment map. This affects the lighting, or at least affects how the lighting influences the sword in game. So on these lighter parts, you can probably guess that this is where the light will shine most directly, most prominently, or whatever. Now here, if I wanted to change things, it would be possible. I'd probably use a color selection tool and select a few of these shades of gray in here, and it would select all of that and not mess with the hilt or the crossbar. But that makes it really difficult because if you do the UV properly, you can easily just use a selection tool to gather around certain parts or whatnot to choose, what exact parts of the blade you want to be affected by the light. But Anyway, now that I've covered that, we're going to be working with the steel sword. So let's say that this is the texture that I made through Blender. Alright, let's say this is my PNG. Now, the thing about the Skyrim Creation Kit is it doesn't accept PNGs or JPGs, obviously, for its textures. It uses a different format so that it can compress the textures properly and offer bitmaps. Now, what bitmaps are smaller versions of the texture until it gets pretty low resolution. Pretty low resolution. It just keeps going and going and going. This is so that when you select something like an option like use low quality, it will use one of these lower or smaller bitmaps rather than this one, so that your performance in game is higher. Now, something's up with your computer and you need improvements if you actually select low settings in game, but that's another issue on its own. You're going to want to set these up, but thankfully it can do it automatically if you have the right plugin. You don't have to manually make these bitmaps yourself and scale it over and over again. You can just auto-generate them. And we'll get into that in a second. What you're going to need for this tutorial are the normal map plugin for GIMP and the DDS plugin for GIMP, because that plugin is what's going to let you auto-generate these bitmaps and actually import DDS files or create them as well. So I'm working right here with a DDS image already, but I'm just going to show you, just so that I can show you how to generate the bitmaps yourself, I will delete these. So right now we have our texture, just a standard texture that we made, or that is, this is what Bethesda made, but I'm again using this as an example. So here's our texture, and let's say we want this to look like it kind of comes out of the fabric of the hilt, so it looks more realistic, because you don't want to make these manually in your model. You want it to look like a texture, because making these indentions in the model might look really nice and probably even better, but this is a much easier approach to it. This is something that has entered the game world for a long time. It's something called normal mapping. And what normal mapping is it lets you choose what parts of your texture bulge out or kind of sink in. So if we were to want these little indentions to sink in, or these ones to sink in, and these two stay where they are or bulge outward, we would just add a normal map to our sword. So let's make a normal map. Now what Bethesda has, it looks like this. Looks like this. They don't have the entire thing normal map. I mean, because they just used transparency. What we're going to do is a different kind of approach. You can always do it a little differently, but it's going to be fine. It's going to work, and it's going to look really good in game. Just as good. So I'm going to close this out again. And I'm going to show you how to do this. If you have your normal map plugin, then this should work. I will leave the links to those plugins, by the way, in the description below, so you can go grab them for GIMP, unless you're using Photoshop or something, and you can just use, I don't know, plugins for Photoshop, and I think Photoshop already has a normal mapping option. But anyway, you're gonna want to go to filters and then map, and down here it says normal map. And you'll get plenty of settings. Plenty. You can play around with this how you want and see the results, what you're getting, but I just like to leave it as is, then select scale and hit about the negatives. What this is going to do is it's going to affect different parts of your texture. Sometimes sometimes if it's negative, it'll push these indentions in or out, so you'll just have to see which one does it correctly. So here's our -6. I usually like to do a value of 6. Don't want to do it too much or it'll look too sharp in game, and I don't want to do it too little or there'll be almost no difference. So here's -6. Let's see how it looks. And this is actually just about what I want. See, you can see these are indentions, and these kind of metal parts are coming more toward you. Same for this. It's working just fine. So let me tell you, this will work just as well as the normal map that Bethesda made. They just have transparency. That doesn't matter because it isn't like these are parts of the sword. So here's a normal map. Let's export it. So just hit Control-Shift-E or whatever your hotkeys are, and we're gonna export this probably to our main folder here. So we have it already set up, steelsword.dds. We're gonna want to put a suffix there, which will be _in, so that we know this is a normal map. Hit enter, and it's going to ask us, well, how do we want to compress it? Well, for normal maps, we're going to want DTX5 or DTX5N. Doesn't really matter. They work this pretty much the same way. Then you'll see this, as I was telling you about before. This is generate bitmaps. You're going to want those bitmaps so they match up with the bitmaps from the textures. So that if you've got a smaller bitmap texture, you won't have all of the wrong places being emphasized respective to that texture bitmap. So there's some advanced options here. Those are fine. Just leave those alone. This is all you have to worry about. Now remember, this is only for normal maps, DXT5. Can hit OK, and now we have that exported. It's as easy as that, of course, after you've made your texture. So now let's talk about exporting textures in the first place. Let's undo this so that we have our normal texture. You're going to do the same thing, just without this. If you want, you could do like diffuse, just so it's so that you recognize it better. But they just leave it like this, and I do as well, because any other map is what's gonna need that suffix. So export, generate bitmaps. Now for this, you're going to want a different one, DXT3. And actually, to be honest, DXT5 will be just fine. But I like to, stick to tradition or whatever and use DXT3. Now, something important, if you have alpha in your texture, that is transparency, you're going to, no matter what, want DXT1, or things can get really messy. So let's say in here I were to have some transparency. This should work, yeah. If I were to have some transparency right here, no matter what, I'm going to want DXT1. Actually, let's use a different kind of example. Let's say I wanted to see through this blade on these sides. This looks kind of bad, but let's say I wanted a hole through this blade, and I'd want to see through that hole in game. Then I'd need DXT1, or this opening really, it won't show up. So that's why. So let's just leave it like this and export it as DXT1. So export DXT1, because we have that alpha in there. So there's that one. Now this looks bad, so we're not actually going to do that. So for anything that does not have alpha and is a normal texture that you're going to see in Skyrim, you're going to want DXT3 or DXT5. Alpha, DXT1. Remember that, because that is important. Now let's go over environment maps. Bethesda has their environment map for the steel sword as kind of smaller. That doesn't really matter. You can leave it the same size or whatever. It shouldn't affect it too much. They seem to have wanted about half the size. If you're a little more paranoid about that, go ahead, but it'll still work. Now they have this part right here blacked out. if you look here, you can tell this is where your hand is going to grip the sword. This is the hilt. This is the fabric on the hilt. So they were probably thinking, well, we don't want light to reflect off of the hilt. That would just look weird. So they're going to use a black brush and black it out. And for here as well, they didn't want light reflecting very well on this part of the sword. As you can see, they even made it a little dark in here, so you can tell what their intentions were. So they blacked it out there, because anything on your texture here, on your environment map, that is blacked out, isn't going to be affected by the light. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to be able to see it or something, or it's just going to be completely black. It just means no light is going to reflect off of it. The lighter shades of gray here are where the light is going to be most reflecting. So let's talk about making one of these. Let's close this down. Let's make an environment map, our own environment map. I'm going to select it all, and I'm going to use colors, desaturate. And this is going to give us a good grayscale. Now, these options can usually show some color differences. Right here, it doesn't seem to be, but I usually like to choose luminosity, so it really focuses on making sure that the lighter parts of the sword are going to be lighter. So luminosity on desaturate, and now we've made kind of a grayscale of our image. Everything is now black and white. So we're going to do what Bethesda did, something that I usually don't do, to be honest. And we're going to grab this fabric right here. It doesn't need to be perfect. And just black it out like that. And now what's going to happen is light won't reflect off of the hilt in game. At least until we also do this part, which is important as well, because it is also part of the hilt. So now no light is going to be reflecting off of our hilt, and it'll look a little more realistic. Let's do the same over here, because that's kind of what Bethesda wanted. Let's do this the same thing, you know, this is what we're going for. Now, I have something weird going on right here, though. Right here, I have this allowing a lot of light to get on it, and right next to it, it's going to be like, no light. No light, please. So we don't want that, because it's just going to look a little bit unrealistic in game. So we're going to take the opacity, bring it down a bit, and kind of add a little more on the sides that's not so powerful. So now it'll be a little more gradual. So there's that. Now over here it doesn't really matter, because all of the fabric, nothing's going to be reflecting off of that. And the fabric is a different material look than the steel. Now, I kind of like the way it is now. Let's compare it to what we had from Bethesda's folders. Should be this one. See, they've got a little more over here on the blades though, and I can see why. Actually, I guess in here would be a little more shadow. So let's add that in as well. Let's keep low opacity, lowish. Probably bring it up a little bit more. I'm going to zoom in using Shift plus. Some in here as well. Kind of like that. Kind of better. I probably actually kept about 40 opacity or so. Maybe that's a little too dark. So just experiment with what you've got until you like what you've got. I don't know. There's that. So after you're done here, we're going to export it. Our favorite part. So for environment maps, it's also going to be DXT1, because in environment maps, you're actually not going to want alpha. For environment maps, usually this background is going to be all one solid color. I recommend leaving it black like I showed you in Blender in the last couple of tutorials, because that can also help make it easier on you creating this. But whatever you want to choose. But DXT1 is what you're going to want for this, even if there's no alpha to it, because in environment maps, you're not going to want that alpha, or the lighting's going to be a little messed up. So make sure you have no alpha in this. So export it, steel sword, and we're going to do _m, not in, because it's not a normal map. And we're going to use DXT1. Generate maps, because we want lower resolution settings. Click OK. And now you have some essential maps for your sword. These are really the only ones I care about. Now there's some that you can use, like cube maps and specular maps, to make it all look even more realistic. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to go over those, because this will look fine in game. Now I'm going to apply these maps to my own sword. We're not going to import these textures into Skyrim. Because, you know, these are already there. Remember, this was all for example. I'm going to go back and switch up that sword, make it looking nice and pretty, instead of, you know, having all of this nasty, whatever nasty is going on here. Remember, never do this. Alright, so that's environment, normal, and diffuse maps. Diffuse maps being the original texture, by the way. So I hope you learned something today, and if you did, go ahead and give this video a like and subscribe for more of these tutorials, because in the next tutorial, we're going to work on getting our sword into Skyrim, finally, and we're going to trudge through the whole Nifscope thing. We've got to get through it. I'm not going to lie, it can be difficult, but we're going to get there. There are only a few simple things you need to know. So, I will see you there.